Hey there, birders, bird watchers, avian enthusiasts, whatever. People interested in birds, I assume. My name's Steve. I'm originally from Cape May, started birding 15, but for the past 7.5 years, I've been living abroad in South Korea, 3 years before that in Germany. But before I go into more of my background, which I promise I'll go into in a later video, separate, let me quickly get to the point why I made this video. Right now we're in the midst, nearing the peak of fall migration in Cape May and other East Coast sites, and I want to get this information out there to you. Ideally a month or two ago, but I've only recently had this idea. So rather than put it off another whole year, I figure I'll get this out there as soon as possible. And hopefully it'll still be of use for you in some of it for 2023 and for next fall and future falls. But real quick, before I jump into the slideshow presentation, question for you. Are you feeling tired? Are you frustrated? Are you worn out, feeling like you're about to give up? You're a novice birder and you've been to the Higby Dike at Cape May. I know, we've all been there. Well, most of us except for the gods. But this tutorial is for you, especially. Maybe for some intermediate birders it'll be useful too, I hope. Any expertise I have gained has been due to the help of many mentors. Spoiled for choice growing up in Cape May. Just so many excellent, patient, willing to give all their time. But in addition to those irreplaceable mentors, a number of great resources, books and tapes and CD-ROMs, which are now online for free. I'll mention in the slides specifically what I'm talking about. I'm going to share with you the secret weapon. For the sake of argument, assume you don't have a camera. You want to identify the birds using good old binoculars and your senses. Well, it's possible using a combination of GIS, which is general impression, size, and shape, to identify birds with some field marks, maybe some color you see, but often birds, for example, at dawn at the Higby Dike in Cape May, often the coloration is strongly affected by the rising sun in your behind you. So rather than that, size and shape, proportions of different parts of the bird become much more important than coloration. And I'm not going to go into detail of that, at least in this tutorial. But the other weapon they have is the flight call, which at first seemed daunting, but when you learn to read spectrograms or sonograms, as they're often called in the birding world, you'll add another dimension to your bird identification toolbox. And through my experience, I've come to learn that the only way to truly master flight calls is to combine studying sonograms while listening to recordings, as I will teach you in this tutorial, with time in the field. And the more time you spend listening to real wild birds, putting your study into practice and honing it, the sooner you'll master the technique, if it can be mastered, because there are just some birds that even the experts can't identify. Many zeeps are very, very similar, and if they're not heard well under nearly excellent conditions, they have to go as warbler spa at best. And so without further ado, let's jump in. Okay, wood warbler flight calls, which are given during nocturnal migration and diurnal migration in the early morning, known as morning flight. And these are birds seen mostly along the East Coast, such as Higbee Beach at Cape May, New Jersey, as seen in the background here. On a good morning with moderate northwest winds, you may see twice this many people up there at dawn, watching the spectacle of morning flight. So these are birds that are moving south overnight. They see the Delaware Bay on the one side and the Atlantic Ocean on the other, and they think, I don't have enough fuel to cross that. So they come and land, and then as they disperse, because the land gets quite narrow at the point there, many of the birds, they turn around and they head west and then north. Yeah, as I promised, put a few, there's many resources you can find on the internet now, and there's apps, of course, Merlin app for bird sounds recognition. But yeah, there's two great books. Well, I know the Eastern Guide for sure. I haven't looked at the Western yet, but Nathan Piplo, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correct, but like the mnemonic for piping plover. But Nathan's yeah, put together some great books that go over not just flight calls, but bird sounds in general. And if you're new to this field, I think these are one of the best places to start. I think he describes very well the different aspects of sonograms or spectrograms and how to read them while listening and learning calls more effectively, along with mnemonics and other tricks, basically. And then on the bottom here is oldbird.org. Now, when I got started in birding, I don't know if it was a year before or a year or two after the CD-ROM came out, Flight Calls of Migratory Birds, North American land birds. And but now, fortunately, it's been made available for free. You just go to oldbird.org and you can find all the information on that CD-ROM originally produced by Bill Evans and Michael O'Brien. And a lot of what I'm going to show is based on the sonograms from this resource. So this video is also for those who want to add a dimension to their enjoyment of fall migration at key hotspots where especially this morning flight phenomenon takes place, such as in Cape May. So yeah, sonograms are, if you hear spectrogram, sonogram, basically the same thing. It's a visual representation used to display and analyze information about sound. So here on the right is an example of a spectrogram. So that's what I have here in yellow on the left. D equals 1 for dimension 1. First dimension is time. So this is going from left to right. And the second dimension, D2, is the vertical axis, or the height. And this corresponds to pitch or frequency. Pink, why not? Okay. So if time goes from left to right, then what we see here in the beginning is the pitch starts out relatively high and drops till here. And then as time goes on, the pitch rises again and kind of levels out at the end. Right? A total of 50 to 100, so about 50 milliseconds in length. Okay, and let me clear that. The mouse back. The third dimension, D3, is the boldness. So you can think of this, yeah, how dark. For example, here on where the pitch rises on the right side, it's a little bit darker than on the left, right? So that you can think of as a third dimension coming out of the screen. And that darkness, the amount of that darkness is proportional to the loudness or the volume of the call. Things you can notice when you see a spectrogram like this. First is changes in pitch, like I showed before. You see it falls first and then rises and levels off. Dip and an arch, The other point is to notice which parts are emphasized or boldest. So, like I said, on the right here, it's a little bit bolder. So if you're not hearing the full call, is a bird really high up or far away, or if there's some sort of attenuation of the sound that you can't hear it very well, the part you will hear is the boldest part. So that's why this species, which actually is the first species I'll talk about in a second, is described not as a dip, but as a rising call, because that's the part that's emphasized, boldest in the picture. The other thing is modulation. Now this call here is very, if you zoom in enough, you can find some modulation, and what I mean by modulation is the pitch changes under very short time scale. So very narrow left to right. It goes up and down in pitch very fast and repeats like this. So if you superimpose this sort of vibration along the length of the call, this sound will be more buzzy sounding. And without that, so if I clear that, the lack of that up and down, it's very smooth, straight lines smoothly going up and down, and more modulated calls that give like a buzzy sound, bzzz, or insect-like, have these strong modulations. So that's a quick introduction to reading the 3 dimensions of the spectrogram or sonogram. Now, first species, there's a chart here from Trektellan. I think it's, written there, trektellan.nl. And that is that's where all the data from the morning flight in Cape May and other point counts around the world are collected. So you can actually look at data. Maybe I'll make a separate tutorial on that. But for now, let's just look at this here. This is showing the average number per hour in standard week. So you have August 1st, August 6th, up until the last week in October on the far right. This is the period of the count, the morning flight count at Higbee Beach. And as you can see, they show up. Well, even a few of them could be in July, but the count officially starts. I'll have to check on this. Probably when I'm editing this, I'll add it in what the answer is. But I think it used to be from mid-August, they started the count, and it got extended to August 1st. But maybe it's even earlier, officially. Regardless, there are people up there counting yellow warblers, especially even in probably the last week of July. But the count has been going on officially since the early 2000s, I know. And but the peak is definitely September 3rd. And if you're watching this right as this comes out, it's already, they're around, but definitely not in numbers like they used to be. Overtaken probably by, if not, right today, then in the next week, they're going to be overtaken by yellow rump warblers, myrtle, yellow rumps, butterbutts, which is a species I'll include in the next video. Most of the birds that you'll see are like in this old picture I took of either a female or a young male. So it's one of the most abundant species seen in Cape May on the East Coast migration. And so that's why, this is why I'm including it first in this series, because it's a good call to learn first. It's quite distinctive and you'll hear it a lot. And as with visual ID of birds, paying attention to the most common species first, learning to identify them, get comfortable IDing those birds, it'll be more easy later on to recognize the similar but slightly off calls of different species. So if this initial short drop was gone, this would just be a sweet, and that's the part you mainly hear, but it has this like ts in the beginning, which is this little dip that you can just pick up in the very beginning of the call. And let's listen. Did you hear that? See? You may have to listen a couple times, a couple thousand times. Wow, between those extremes. And there's a couple other examples here. By the way, these are all taken from the oldbird.org website. So it has a very sweet, almost whistleable, emphasized on the rising part. And yeah, so this is definitely the most common bird you'll hear. Yeah, second half of August and first half of September. Yeah, so the pitch varies a little bit, but usually it's quite high, like this, between 6 and 8 kilohertz. Kilohertz means, so kilo is in a way the opposite of milli. Instead of one part out of 1,000, it means 1,000 parts. So 1,000 hertz. And a hertz is 1 cycle per second. So we're talking about, yeah, thousands of cycles per second. This is the order of bird songs is usually between, on this scale, between 2 and 10, more towards the higher half of that. Okay, next species, black and white warbler is another, I was gonna say it's an early season migrant, but actually you can see them well into, almost into October. They'll be one of the dominant species in the second half of August, and you'll see them throughout September in decent numbers. And so it's another bird to get used to early in the season. The call is quite similar. If you just look at the basic shape, it drops down. You kind of blur the modulations. It looks quite similar to the Redstart. There's a couple fine differences, but the main difference really is it's much more buzzy. And it's got actually, as I'll show in the next slide, a different sort of buzzy modulated call. This one's quite fine, meaning that the distance between consecutive up and down oscillations is very short. It's, yeah. And other birds, the modulation's more wide, and you can almost hear individual slow down, of course, but so let's just listen to one example here. It's kind of, you hear rising. So it's more of a zeep than a seep, or a seep. Yeah, it's more sibilant than the American Redstart, which again here is almost whistly, a very tiny modulations. With naked eye you can't see, not zooming in more. So you see the scales here are both, you know, up to 10 kilohertz. So on the same vertical scale, the modulations are much greater in black and white warbler, and you can hear that if you, with some practice. I want to emphasize here, starting out with the most common species, which you're going to hear more of to get practice in the field. Okay, so the next species is yellow warbler. Now this bird is definitely on the way out if you're watching this in 2023. Depending when you watch this in 2023, maybe completely gone. As of today, they're still being seen in at least single digits, but they're also the first migrant warbler in the fall, at least to pass by in strong numbers. There's always a few Louisianas also around, yeah, in late July, maybe mid-July earliest. In fact, I remember one day, probably mid to late July, I was not thinking about fall migration, going fishing with my grandfather one Saturday morning, and I remember hearing over where his boat docked in the tidal marshes along New Jersey's south coast, this zeep, 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 zeep going overhead, several per minute at least. And it was just, yeah, magical. And you'll get on an early northwest wind, in early or middle July, you'll get these big yellow warbler pushes in the early season. And it's really interesting because, the temperature still, even with the northwest winds, is quite warm that time of year, and you're not thinking at all about fall migration. Summer's, just halfway finished officially for us, but for birds, yeah, it's fall already. So that's really cool if you can see that. So here, there's two things to note. First, or rather three things. So first, it's quite dark. All three examples here, especially the middle portion. And the other is there's no dip and then rise. These are all very straight, level calls. So there's no rising or falling tone. But they're not, like I drew here, straight lines, which would be just a whistle, but in fact modulated. And the modulation means buzzy, right? So these are buzz. But notice, now this slide I didn't include, I still have to go back. Okay, so yeah, actually I'll leave this modulation drawing here. And if I go back to the previous slide, now look, the modulation for yellow warbler here, this pink drawing, and in the image is the modulation for black and white warbler. It's quite a big difference in the modulation, right? And these are pretty much to scale, the same time scale, pretty much. So the yellow warbler, or the black and white warbler, let's listen one more time. Now here's the yellow warbler. Now this one's much better. Maybe I'll slow it down. Some of them can be a little bit higher, so it varies in pitch, but it's level. It's a rough buzz, you could say. It's a roughly modulated. To me, it's a very robust sound. Kind of dry, a little dry, not very liquidy. So actually, about the time this video is coming out, in the second half of September, really blackpoll warbler, it's the most dominant zeep call from roughly the middle of September, and then yeah, into a little bit into October. You'll probably till half of October, first half of October, you'll have variable numbers mixed in with all the yellow rumps of blackpolls. And a lot of people say that that's actually the first zeep to learn because it's the most moderate, where it's if you compare all the other warblers that have a zeep-like call in the so-called ZEEP complex, then it's easier to compare the other species to the black pole. But I'm starting with the yellow warbler because, at least in the experience of Cape May, this is the dominant ZEEP you'll hear early in the season. Compared to yellow, black pole is higher pitched and not as loud. And I'm going to go more in detail with the black pole in the next part. Sure. Okay, and the fourth and final species I'm going to talk about in this first installment is the Cape May warbler. Well, since I've been talking about Cape May, in the fall, Cape May warbler is surprisingly common. I would say it's one of the more uncommon birds, if that makes sense. In the spring, they're surprisingly rare, considering their name. Yeah, a nice, beautiful plumaged male in spring finery is reportable, and people will go, if they're reasonably close by, people will go chase the bird, short distance chasing within Cape May County to get a good look at a nice male spring Cape May warbler. But in the fall, well, it still may be tricky to see them in the field. Quite a few come over the, pass over the Higbee Dike, the morning flight count, through the season, largely in early September to mid-September. And yeah, usually they're flying quite high and they give equally high calls. In fact, some will describe them as piercing. And there's a little drop at the tail, slightly descending. Soft buzz, we'll call it soft buzz. Okay. So let's listen to. This is the first call where we have a distinct, real descent in the call. And there's another species, which I'm going to talk about next time, that actually right about now is peak time for, and that is northern parula or parula. And that you can see here has a strong descending call with less, like a sharper peak in the beginning and then a fall. So among the descending calls, the Cape May is higher sounding, less, not descending quite as much, soft descend, if you will, and is a little bit buzzier, which you can see in the modulations. So, and I have to add that on more than one occasion, I've heard the warning, cover your ears, it's a Cape May at the morning flight. So it's a species known for its relatively high call. The fall season distributions for Cape May morning flight specifically. And as you saw before, the American Redstart looks like this. Well, below is not a copy of the same graph. This is a black and white warbler. 7 per hour is a peak September 3rd, but within the same week, American Redstart numbers peak too. This is averaged over the course of 20 years or so. And of course, the peak average number is much higher for Redstarts. There's just many more American Redstarts that migrate through. But it's interesting, at least slightly amusing to me, that these two species that have similar migration timing distributions also have very similar calls. The main difference being the modulations in the black and white. Maybe I'm just getting nerdy here, but and then we talked next about the yellow warbler, which I mentioned is early season. Now look at very different topology to this distribution, with the peak being actually the first week of August. And that's because if you extend this graph further to the left, you'll see similar numbers here going into at least middle of July. September 24th, around the time that this video is coming out, if everything goes well, my planning, then yeah, there won't be many yellow warblers at all. Less than one per hour, a few around, but you'll be able to hear some of those zeeps, but you're going to be hearing many more blackpoll zeeps probably. So this, yeah, yellow warbler is something for people watching this in 2024 before the fall season, more so. But Cape May warblers are still around fine. As I put this red arrow, actually this weekend is the peak time for Cape May warblers, as many as 4 per hour on average day this week. So you should hear a few of those. So with that, I'd like to just have quick acknowledgements. So yeah, the sonograms and recordings from oldbird.org, as I mentioned, images from Sam Gallick and Mike Crew, who I borrowed from the what is it, View from the Cape May Birding blog website, when they were back in, I think, 2012 and 2013, around those years. In the archives, you can find many nice pictures from them. Yeah, and then the data that I showed from trektellen.nl. And then the final key points are here in fall orange on the right. Number one, try not to get frustrated. It's going to take time and practice. Yeah, the more time you listen in the field, plus studying when you're not in the field with this video and my others that will shortly come out soon, but also these other resources, especially oldbird.org, you will see steady improvement for sure. And that's the main thing that counts, not the end, like getting to be the expert, but enjoying the journey of steadily improving your skill little by little. Like first step will be like, oh, I know that that's a Redstart. And that way, you know, when you get used to hearing the Redstarts, you can kind of ignore them unless it's a beautiful adult male. Then you got to try getting a photo or keep your bins on it for a few seconds at least. But if there's a bunch of other species going by that are giving calls you don't recognize as Redstart or yellow warbler, one of these more common ones, then you can focus on that bird instead of, not knowing the calls and a bunch of birds, multiple species suddenly zip overhead, and you're choosing which, you think about which one do I focus on? Focus on the one giving the call that you don't recognize. Maybe that's a cerulean or a Connecticut. Yeah, so I hope in any case you enjoy the fall migration spectacle. That's what we're out there for. Not to ID every single bird, but this will be a fun new journey, a new dimension you'll be adding. So happy fall, everyone. And please like this video if you enjoyed it, as well as any feedback you want to write in the comments about how I can improve these videos. And yeah, see you in the next video. In part 2, I'll be going over some more common late fall species that are more relevant. So really less than a week that should be up from the date that this is going up. So you can enjoy learning a little bit flight calls before your next visit to migration hotspot. Or maybe that hotspot is your backyard, you never knew it. Anyway, enjoy the fall migration, and I'll see you next time.